Well, hey, church family, I hope that you're doing well today. I hope this finds you well. This is definitely going to be a different Sunday for us. As you know, at this point, we've canceled our Sunday morning gathering, and we're posting this sermon online today. This is definitely not something that a decision that we took lightly. This is something that we thought quite heavily, prayed quite heavily over, and sought the counsel of medical professionals in our church family, and felt that it would be best that we refrain from gathering in the corporate body today. We do this to continue to help not spread the coronavirus and just comply to some of the things that the governor has asked us as the church to do. And so while this is going to be different and strange, I do believe that this is a timely message for you, for our church, and for the state that we are in as a country. And so I believe that God has really ordained this timing of this message. And so I would encourage you of a couple things as we get started today. I would encourage you to continue to give faithfully online. You can give online via our website, via our app, and we hope that you will continue to do that. We have missionary partners and people that we are continuing to support, and we need to faithfully be able to continue to do that. And so we highly encourage you to continue to give. I would like to encourage you to be the church during this time, for you to care for those around you. Maybe you have elderly family members. Maybe you know of elderly people inside of our church. We would encourage you to continue to check on them. Make sure there's nothing that they need from the grocery store. Make a run to the grocery store for them if they are trying to stay away from public places. And so I just encourage you to be the church in this moment, in this time, and encourage you to love on people, love on your neighbors, as we try to comply and do our best to not spread this virus. We, at this point, have canceled our midweek for this coming Wednesday night, the 18th. I would encourage you to continue to faithfully study God's Word, to pray for our country and for this virus and the things that are going on right now. We will continue to keep you updated as we progress through this and navigate these tough times. But today, we're going to dive into a message out of the book of Matthew. We're going to continue on in this series of the Sermon on the Mount. And so we're in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. So let me pray for us, and then we will dive into God's Word. God, I thank you for today. I know this is different than what we normally do on a Sunday morning, but I know that you are in control. I know that you've ordained these things, and you understand them, and even when we don't. And so, God, I pray that we would not have a spirit of fear, but a spirit and a sound mind of loving and caring and understanding that you are in control. And so, God, I ask today that you would speak through this message, through your word, to your people, and through this message to the time that we're dealing with. And so, God, I ask that you would soften hearts, that you would stir in affections, and that in this time that you would draw us closer to yourself through this message. God, I pray that you would speak through me, allow me to clearly be able to articulate what you have laid on my heart for this message. We thank you and pray that you would bless this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you got your Bibles, we're in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. For me, there's always seemed to be a dilemma that we, as believers, in the life of the believer, that we deal with. A dilemma that is always been inside of the Christian, inside of the church, nonetheless. Something I believe that has plagued us. And I believe that it's plagued us to make decisions sometimes that as we walk through life, that sometimes we isolate ourselves, walking through life away from those in society and not with those in society. The dilemma is, how do we fit into this world? As believers, where is our place? Where is our place that we fit in? And I believe these are good and valid questions for us to ask as believers who follow Christ. And when we look at the Scriptures, we see some Scriptures that begin to talk to us about these things. And I just want to read some of these to you. And as we look through this, 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17 says this: "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever." Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, by the testing, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And then James 4:4 says this: "You adulterous people, do you not know that your friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." As we read these things, it begins for us to ask questions as believers. What is our place in the world? Have you ever questioned that? I know that I have. I have questioned as how do we position ourselves as believers inside of the world? Where's our place? How do we fit in? How do we figure out how to navigate through the daily things of life and not be conformed to the world, but in the world? How do we do that? And so I believe that it is important for us to think about those things, how we position ourselves inside of the community, inside of our local community. And when we see these passages that I just read, we begin to ask the question and we begin to try to understand, what does God desire for us? Well, we find ourselves in this passage as we've continued on from the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is the very next passage that comes to play, and I believe that it is so crucial for the place that we are at. You know, we've been going through the Beatitudes and we learned so many things about the Christian life from the Beatitudes. We learned so many things about what we should and should not do. We even learned at the last sermon of the Beatitudes about that this Christian walk would definitely lead to some type of persecution in some way, shape, or form. But I hope that today, as we walk through this passage, that we can glean from God's Word as we look into this passage. So Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16 says this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." Verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Now, the first thing I want us to think about and really just begin to ask is, who is Jesus talking to? This is the first question is when I approach things like this, who is Jesus talking to? Who is he talking to in this passage, and does it apply to me and you? Does it apply to us today in our context and what we are doing? And when I look back at the beginning of chapter 5 in Matthew, it says this in verse 1. "Seeing the crowds, he, Jesus, went up on the mountain, and he sat down, and his disciples came to him." See, there seems to be two groups here in this passage that Jesus is addressing. There seems to be the massive crowd of people and also his disciples. Now, his disciples were those who were closest to him, who he was investing into and pouring into. And he had 12 disciples in which he did that. And then there were 3 more in which he invested even deeper with. And so, what does this mean for us in this passage? What does this mean as Jesus is addressing the disciples, his followers, and those who were following him? Well, if you are a believer, if you are a follower of Christ, then this is for you. This is for me and for you. He's addressing us. And I believe there's something here that we can learn from in what Jesus is saying. I think it is a very important for us today, especially in the time that we are in. In both of these sections, he starts off with "you are." Now, I want you to think about that. And we're going to talk about this a couple of times today as we walk through this. But he says you are. Not that you will be, not that you can be. He says you are. Right now, these are the things that you are about. You are salt and light. And Jesus is saying these are traits in which we should be exhibiting in our lives. He is talking to you and to me directly. This is where I think we have to perk up in our seats and begin to think about what Jesus is saying and heed his words. No matter where you are in life right now, no matter what you're dealing with today, no matter the weight of the things that you're walking in, no matter of the sin that you're dealing with today, no matter the pressure that you're dealing with, I believe that this passage is valuable and important for you. See, this is probably one of the most practical passages that we could look at in all of Scripture. No matter what job you have, no matter what stage of life that you're in, no matter where you are right now, this is for you. See, Jesus is directing this to his disciples. And if we are followers of Christ, we are his disciples. And that is for us. And so it's important. So I have 2 things that I want you to think about today as we navigate through this passage. This passage is really broken up into 2 sections. And these are the 2 things. The first one is this. I want to ask you this, and this is our first point. How do you taste? How do you taste? Jesus says that we are to be the salt of the earth. Salt in those days did a couple of things. They were used to preserve and to purify. When salt was used to preserve the food or preserve food, it was used in a way, and when it was applied to the food, in that process of preserving, it would purify the food. In purifying the food, it would make the food last longer without spoiling. And this is the process in which salt actually literally permeates into the food. And see, Jesus knew his followers, the people who were around him, the crowd, the disciples, he knew that those people in that audience at that moment would know and understand the process in which he was talking about of salt. See, salt was very valuable in those days. It was very valuable to preserve these things in food, to make food last longer. Salt was also a way that people got paid. Many times in those days, people would use salt as a form of currency to pay people for their labor, for their wages. It's actually the word that we get for salt, its origins, is the same place we get the word salary from. And so Jesus knew that, and putting it in this context, that his people, those followers, would know what he was talking about. And he's addressing this crowd. And he's emphatically saying, you are, not you can be, not you will be, you are. That's right, you are the salt of the earth. This is where we take heed to Jesus' words, and we begin to allow this to soak in and understand he is speaking to us. This is a trait in which he desires for us to have as believers. Jesus is trying to help us to understand where our place, this dilemma that we talked about. He's trying to get us to understand where our place is in the world. He's saying you should be the salt and the light. He's giving us directions. He's instructed his people to be and to do. And this is what I want you to think about. Salt was used to preserve and to purify. He desires for us to mingle among the people of this earth. He desires for us to be intricately involved so that we can permeate the culture, so that we can be involved, that we can rub shoulders and rub off. And this permeation leads to purification of the people that we're around. Now, I'm not saying that we as Christians, just being in the presence of someone is going to lead to salvation, or that is salvation. We understand that salvation is through faith alone, through grace alone. The grace that Jesus has lavished upon us. But once we have become followers of Christ, once we have become disciples, once that has happened, the rest of our time here on earth should be devoted, should be spent as we invest and we influence others for the good of the gospel, for the gospel to go forth, for others to see a difference in us. This is that permeation into the culture in which I believe that Jesus is telling us here. He's telling us to be a part of the culture, to soak in, to let what is inside of us, the salt that is inside of us, the good stuff, to soak into our world around us, to affect it in a good way. And this is a dilemma that we face in our world today. Where do we find this balance, this harmony of where we should land as a believer? I believe too often as believers, we tend to lean into isolation versus influence. I believe that we sometimes isolate ourselves from the culture instead of being a part of the culture and being influenced or being influential in the culture, that we rub off on people. I don't think we can take ourselves away from the culture. We have to rub off on the culture. I want you to think about salt with me for just a little bit. When you're using salt in the cooking process, when you use salt, does whatever you've used the salt on, is it the same as it was before and after? Well, of course not. When we use salt, we use it for a reason. We use it to flavor. We use it to season and to make the flavor change. And this is what Jesus is saying to us. We should, as believers, leave a different taste in people's mouth from when we were there, or from our influence, or how we have conversations. We should leave a different taste in people's mouth. And so I know for me that I have been in situations where I have sat down in someone's home, and maybe you've been in this same place where you've sat down in someone's home for a home-cooked meal, per se. And you sat down, and maybe this is the first time that you've ever eaten this person's cooking, and you begin to sit down and you dig into the food, and all of a sudden, it's not a desirable taste. And the question is, what's the first thing that you usually ask for? What's the first thing that you usually do is you ask for the salt. Hey, can you pass the salt, please? Because we know that the salt, we can leave the salt on the table, in the middle of the table, and it's not going to do any good for our food that we are eating. It's not until the salt is applied to the food that the flavor changes. And this is the part of this that we have to think about as believers. Jesus is telling us that we are this salt. We are the different flavor that is supposed to mix in and mingle into our culture to change, to preserve, and to purify our culture. I wholeheartedly believe if we were not in the culture as believers, that this world would be in an even worse place than it is right now. But God has left us here. He has given us the Holy Scriptures, His Word, to learn and to grow and to continue to invest into our culture to make a difference. And so He has left us here for that. And so when we use salt, it makes a difference. When we use salt to flavor food for a meal, it makes a difference. And that's what we in this world are supposed to be. We're literally supposed to rub off on others. We are literally supposed to leave a different taste in people's mouth. We need to leave an impression on people that they see that there's something different. And the only difference that they can understand and see is that Jesus is living inside of us. And that He's living inside of us in such a way that it's pouring out of us. You know, in Matthew I think it's chapter 12, Jesus says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. This is what He's talking about. This salt that is supposed to be us, that we are supposed to be, should be something that wells up in us in a way that it comes out, that people see this. And so the question I want to just ask you is, do you taste different? Do you taste different to those that you are around? When you are around people, do people see a difference in you? Or do people get a bad influence? And people have a bad taste in their mouth when you leave them. He continues on in verse 13. He says, he continues. It's right there in 13. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. And in the second part of verse 13, he says, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? He follows up with, it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown down and trampled under people's feet. Do you understand what Jesus is saying here? Jesus is saying there's different types, different qualities of salt. And we know this to be true today. There are different types and different qualities of salt out there. Some salt is better at flavoring food than some. In essence, its saltiness is better for the taste. But there's some salts that's not true about. There's some salts that are not good for that type of application for food. And I want you to think about it in this way. Now understand, we would not use the salt that's on our table, the salt that we use to flavor food during a bad weather event. If we needed to salt the road or salt our driveway, we are not going to take out the salt shaker and that flavorful salt to put onto the road. No, we're going to get a different type of salt. And Jesus says here that there's different types of salt and that there's different flavors to salt. And if a salt loses its saltiness, how is it going to regain its flavor? That it's good for nothing except to be trampled under people's feet. Now, I believe that this is probably exactly what Jesus is trying to get His disciples and the followers to understand, is that some salts are not good. And that's not what we as believers should be. We should not be the degraded salt that we were to use to be on the road or on the ground to salt the hazardous roads or what have you. We should be the salt that is used for flavor, for something that leaves good taste in your mouth. Paul reminds us of this in the book of Colossians in chapter 4. He says this, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Now, I believe that this is very, very important for us today, especially in the midst of dealing with the coronavirus and all that's going on right now in our world, and our country, and just the chaos that's kind of ensuing. How should we respond as believers? Should we react with fear? Should we react with just total panic? No, I don't believe so, because as believers, we know who's in control. We know that God is ultimately sovereign and that He holds all of this in His hand. And we shouldn't fear. We should understand that God loves us, that He cares deeply for us, and that we shouldn't panic. There should be no need for panic. Now, there should be cause for concern, sure, but it also leads us to understand what our response is supposed to be in our culture. Right now, I don't think that we should put ourselves in a place that we completely isolate ourselves to help no one. We should be concerned about those around us. Like I said in the beginning, we should be concerned about our elderly. And maybe you have some of those people in your family. We should be checking on them. Maybe you have neighbors who are elderly. We should be caring for them in this time. We are to be the salt of the earth, especially during this time, especially during this season. And so Jesus has given us this portion of Scripture, and it is timely for us right now to understand where we sit. So I'd encourage you, as you go through this time, as we deal with this phase of life, I would encourage you to be the salt, to be the hands and feet of Jesus where you are, in your neighborhood, on your street, in your family. Care for one another. Love on one another. Be wise when you do it. But be the salt. Be the salt of the earth. The second thing I want to ask you today is this: how do you shine? See, this salt and light goes hand in hand so well. And Jesus says in verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." So how do you shine? In the midst of the coronavirus and the stuff that we're dealing with right now, how are you shining for Him? Now remember, He has set this charge before us. He again says, you are. Not you can be, not you will be, but you are. Right now, you are the light of the world. You're the light in a dark, dark world that is supposed to shine bright. You know, just as salt permeates that which it is applied to, it permeates and it sinks into, so does light. If you've ever walked into a dark room and you turn the light on, the darkness flees. The darkness flees. Light always wins. Light always wins. And what we know is, even in the dark times of our current state, we know that God is going to win, that He is going to be victorious, that He is going to come out on top, and we have nothing to fear. So He's telling us now to let our light shine brightly. You know, I remember back in the book of John, in chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus said this. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Jesus says He is the light. And if we are followers of Him, then we have taken on His light to shine brightly. Think about the moon. The moon has no source of light, but it reflects the light of the sun. We are supposed to be like the moon. Jesus is the sun. He is the light. He shines brightly, and we are supposed to shine and to reflect that light to the world. And so we know Jesus is the source of light, even from the very beginning, even from creation, the story of creation. We know that the light has shined brightly from that moment. Jesus is that light. This is not a complicated passage. This is not so complex for us to struggle with. This is very simple, but very, very applicable to what we're dealing with. You are the light. Sitting in your house right now, watching this message on your phone, a device, whatever you're doing right now, you are the light. If you're a parent, You are a light to your children. You are the light in a dark world. You are the one that is supposed to encourage them, to uplift them, to help them understand that we don't have to panic. We don't have to worry. God's in control, and we know He wins. We know we win. And so we understand that Jesus is the light. He says that we are that light as well. So I want you to go back and I want you to think about this dilemma that we talked about. Understanding where we fit into the world today. It's a tough question. It's a tough question for us to wrestle with and try to just get some handle on of where's the balance? Where's the balance of what we're supposed to do and what we're supposed to not do? I believe it's simple. I believe it's not that complex. It's a hard thing for us to wrestle with, but I don't think that it's that complex. I think we're supposed to be present in the world. Right now, we're supposed to be present. Even in the midst of the coronavirus and all that's going on, we are supposed to be present for our world. We have to be a part of the world. If we think in any way, shape, or form that what's inside of us is going to rub off on others, we can't isolate ourselves. We have to be amongst the people, rubbing shoulders with the people of this, of our towns, of our cities, of our neighborhoods, of our country, of our world. We have to be rubbing shoulders with them so that we can rub off on them. We're not going to rub off on them if we keep our distance. We're not going to rub off on them if we isolate ourselves. We're only going to rub off if we are in the midst of them, doing life with those who may not believe everything that we believe, who may not agree with everything that we agree on. But we're supposed to be in the world, not of the world. We see this in chapter 12 of Romans. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. We're not supposed to walk through with fear. We're supposed to understand that we're not conformed to this world, but we're transformed by what God has already done, what He's left us in His Word, and we use that to be the salt and the light. So we should not conform to the world, but we have to be in the world. We can't isolate ourselves. We have to be there to witness to those in our neighborhoods, and our cities, and our communities, and our world. We're in a place where, honestly, I honestly didn't think that we would ever be in the midst of this chaos. To say this is strange, to not have you all here today, to be in an empty barn recording this message for you is something I never thought I would have to do. But I know that we have to make decisions for what's best for you, for our community, and I don't think that changes the effectiveness that we can have. I believe wholeheartedly that you in your community, in your neighborhood, is going to be the most influential thing that you can do. Taking your Bible and studying it and learning it is going to be the most influential thing that you can do once you begin to pour that out of you. It's not something that you hold on for yourself, but you intake it, and it wells up out of the abundance of the heart. It wells up out of you into those who you interact with and rub shoulders with. So even in the midst of this chaos that we are dealing with right now, I believe that we have the ability to love on those around us. I believe that we have the ability to be salt in our neighborhoods, in our communities. I believe that we have the ability to be light in our communities. I've already seen some of you begin to post on social media about That's being the hands and feet of Jesus. That's being active and permeating into your community and being active and ever present, being the salt and the light. That is doing this. And so it's important. And I want to close with this today. Most of you know at this point that my grandfather passed away this past weekend. And he passed away on Saturday of last week, and my dad and I began to go and to look at his nursing home and the things in the room, and begin to evaluate the things that needed to be cleaned up, that needed to be assessed. And so as we did that, I came across a Bible. I came across a Bible on his bedside table, and as I looked at that Bible, I began to thumb through it, and I began to look at things, and I began to see something very, very important. I began to see, as I thumbed through, at every chapter marking, I saw a number. First, it was the number 1. And you would see the number 1 by the chapter marking, and you would see it, and then sometimes that number 1 was marked out. That number 1 was marked out with the number 2. And then in some places, that number 2 was marked out with the number 3. And then even in some cases, it was marked out with the number 4. Now, as I began to thumb through my papa's Bible, I began to see that this was not something that was just through one little section, even the New Testament. It was from cover to cover. And what's really wild about this is I began to look through this, I realized that this Bible wasn't that old. It was relatively new. He probably had gotten it in the last 4 to 5 years. Now, my grandfather was 95 years old. And he had began to walk through the Bible sometime in the last 5 to 6 years, this new Bible, and he'd walked through it. From what I can tell, just about every chapter in that Bible, he's read at least 3 times, maybe 4. And it blew me away. Now, it really shouldn't have. It shouldn't have blown me away because growing up, my grandfather always had a Bible sitting on his table next to his chair, and so I shouldn't have been surprised. But it caught me off guard. And as I began to talk to people and visit with people, especially even in the funeral and dealing with those things, everybody said this same thing about my grandfather. They said something was different about him. When you were with him, something was special about him. He loved on everybody. He cared for everybody. He was just something different. And I don't know the things that attributed to make my grandfather different. I don't know how those things happened. It could be the large family that he grew up in. It could be the number of siblings that he had. It could have been his parents. It could have been him being a prisoner of war in World War II. I don't know. But what I do know is that when we take God's word and we put it into our hearts and we study it and we intake it, the abundance of that will overflow out of us and spread to others. See, when I had conversations with people about my papa, everybody said he was a special, special man. And the only thing that I can understand that was drastically changing in him from the drastic stuff that he dealt with is he took God's word to be truth. He understood what it meant to be the salt and light. I wonder today, are you being the salt and light? This has been extremely challenging for me to walk through, to understand. Challenging in a way of really making me step back and ask some questions. Am I being the salt and light? Do I leave a different taste in someone's mouth after they've been with me? Or am I just like everybody else in the world? Are you being the salt and light? Is there something different about you? And when you leave this earth, when your time is over, what will people say about you? Will people say there was something different about Will? There was something different about Papa? That's the question that we all have to ask. And right now, in the midst of this pandemic, what are people going to say about you? Are you going to be different? Are you going to be the salt and the light in this world? Let me pray for you. God, I'm grateful for today. I'm grateful for your word, how it is encouraging for us, how it's challenging for us, how in the midst of the chaos that we are dealing with right now, that we always see encouragement, that you are, it says you are, not you can be or you will be, you are right now the salt and light. We are the salt and light. And you have left us here to be good deposits of what you have entrusted to us, to rub shoulders with those around us, to love on those around us, to shine your light in a dark world. And so as the days ahead are strange and different, things that we've never experienced in our lifetime, God, may you allow us to be your salt and light. May we take your word to heart. May we understand that we are here for you, that we are different because of the intake of your word, because of the study of your word, and out of the abundance of our hearts, our mouths speak, and there's something different. There's a different taste out of our mouth. There's a different light that shines from us. And the only reason, the only explanation is because you are overflowing out of us. So God, I ask today that you would be with our people, that you would keep our people healthy, that you would protect them, and that they would be good stewards of what you have entrusted to them, that you would be the salt and light in a dark world. God, we love you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope and pray that you will continue to be salt and light. I want to encourage you of this one last thing. Be that salt and light. And as you go and as you do, if there's a need that arises, you can contact us on social media. You can contact us at info@gracemeadows.cc. Maybe you find out about a need that is bigger than you can handle, or something that you can do and you need to spread that. Contact us at info@gracemeadows.cc, and we would love to begin to have a conversation about what we can do to help. We thank you. We hope God blesses your day today. Have a good one.